Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm in Cilrhedyn, partly in Pembrokeshire, partly in Carmarthenshire, investigating a 170-year-old murder mystery. Cilrhedyn in 1851 was a sprawling, sparsely populated parish in a hilly and unproductive area of Wales. Life here was hard for those who tried to raise a family on the small tenant farms, and cooperation with neighbours to bring in the hay harvest and do other farm work was vital. It was a close community, but an ever-shifting one as tenants came and went frequently. In one corner of East Cilrhedyn, on a hillside at the source of the Afon Mamog, in the summer of 1851, a foul murder was committed, which was reported in the newspapers all over Wales and made the farm of Blaenycwm notorious. In 1851, Blaenycwm had new tenants. A young couple, only married for a few years, came to try their luck on the poor soil of the hillside here. They were David and Rachel James. Their child John was born here, and to help with the farm they had two servants, Samuel Evans and Ruth Jones. About 5 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of August 1851, David James and Samuel Evans took the cart for the long journey to get coal, a trip that would take them away from the farm for 24 hours. Ruth Jones had slept on Thursday night in company with Anne Evans, a little daughter of their neighbours at Ffynnon, Nathaniel and Ruth Evans. They had talked a lot in the night, and Ruth had asked Anne to sleep with her again that night because she expected some young men to come round. But Anne Evans had been asked to sleep with Rachel James because David and Samuel were away getting the coal. Ruth wanted new shoes. She asked her mistress if she could go to Newcastle Emlyn, it being market day, to buy a pair, and Rachel agreed and gave her 2 shillings and 6pence to buy them. Ruth then walked the 2.5 miles to the market. She returned about 5 o'clock, accompanied part of the way by a farmer's daughter, with a new shawl instead of shoes as she couldn't find any suitable shoes. She then did her work, had her supper, and at 10 o'clock at night was sitting by the fire, having removed her stockings, and talking with her mistress Rachel. Rachel had put 2 loaves of bread in the oven by the fire and made ready to go to bed. She asked Ruth to take the bread out when it was done and put 2 more in to bake, and then herself go to bed. It was a fine moonlit night. Rachel went up to bed, leaving Ruth behind. At 4 the next morning, Rachel's husband David had still not come back. A servant boy came from Blaenycwm farm near Capel Ewan to help out. She got his breakfast and asked him to go upstairs to Ruth's room and call her. He came downstairs and said she wasn't there. Rachel went up to check and found her bed had not been slept in. Rachel did not seem worried. She said she thought Ruth might have been out courting and sent a message to Ffynnon, where Ruth's family lived, about 3 miles away, to see if she was there. David James and Samuel Evans returned to Blaenycwm about 6 o'clock and met Ruth Evans from Ffynnon, who told them Ruth Jones was missing. David said he was alarmed as she'd never gone missing before. People began to search, and 2 small girls, probably from Ffynnon, made a terrible discovery. In the pond, which is the source of the River Mamog, and which lay across the field boundaries between Blaenycwm farm and Blaenau farm, face down in the water was Ruth Jones. William Thomas from Cilrhedyn was present when the body was found, and soon a great many people surrounded the pond. However, some care was taken to preserve the scene. Ruth was lying face down in the water about 1.5 yards from the edge on the Blaenau side. A ladder was fetched, and Benjamin Hughes from Bank of Ellyn Mill went along the ladder, picked up the body and carried it on his back to the bank. Samuel Thomas from Cilrhedyn was also there. He put the time of recovery of the body at between 4 and 5 o'clock. This seems to point to Ruth's body not being found for almost 12 hours from her disappearance being noticed, but she was found only a field away from Blaenycwm farm. Had they waited until a message had come back from Ffynnon, Or was David James' statement that he came back at 6 in the morning wrong, and the body had already been found at that time? Something is distinctly odd here. The pond, as was already mentioned, lay in a dip across 2 fields, one belonging to Blaenycwm and the other belonging to Blaenach. A stone wall, the boundary between 2 fields, was part way across the pond, with a pole across a gap to prevent cattle going through. The pole was still in place, but the wall showed traces of blood. There was a footprint of a man in the mud at the edge of the pond. Rachel Jones, Pantapedydd, a neighbour of Ruth's family at Phosophyne, laid out the body. She said there was a quantity of mud in the upper part of the body, and one hand was clenched and full of mud. Her hair was disordered and covered with mud, as was her face, and there were wounds on her head. She also said she saw finger and nail marks on the neck and face. An inquest was held the following Monday before the coroner George Thomas at the Bluebell Inn, Conwyl Elford, as Ruth's family lived in that parish. The inquest was adjourned, and the pond in which Ruth's body had been found was ordered to be drained. When the inquest recommenced, Police Sergeant George Jones of Newcastle Emlyn said he had seen the blood on the stone wall and the footprint beside the pond on the Blaenach side. The draining of the pond had also revealed many footprints in the bottom, indicating a struggle had taken place. Also here was a neckcloth, and a second one which Ruth used to wear. David James testified that the neckcloth found in the mud belonged to him and his wife, but he said Ruth often borrowed it. The post-mortem report was given by Mr. Hughes, surgeon of Carmarthen. He described the wounds on the girl's head, saying they were at the back of the head going forwards to the front and were probably made by stone or wood and were not self-inflicted. They were not in themselves enough to cause death. He also said she was not pregnant. This last point was important. In his evidence, David James had said several women had accused Ruth of being in that condition, and he himself believed it to be the case. The inquest examined the question of the pregnancy at length. David James said Ruth had been upset at the accusations. His wife confirmed she'd been of a naturally lively and joyful nature, but something had been bothering her lately. The question of who was courting her arose. David James said that he did not know if any of the sons at Blaenach courted Ruth, but some children had been coming after her, and his wife said some lads had been in the habit of coming to the house to joke with her. She'd always denied being pregnant. Anne Evans, the little girl who had been with her the night before she died, said they'd talked a lot, but not of sweethearts. Rachel James also claimed that she'd heard the sound of a man coming to court Ruth at night, and had asked who this was, but Ruth wouldn't say. She did not think Samuel Evans, the farm servant, courted her. No one seemed to have questioned Samuel Evans or asked the sons and farm servant at Blaenach if they knew anything about the suitor. The inquest jury recorded a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown, and despite further inquiries by the police sergeant and constable from Newcastle Emlyn, and 2 meetings of the magistrates at Newcastle Emlyn Town Hall to receive evidence, which were held in camera so nothing is known of what was said, and a £50 reward for information leading to a conviction and a pardon for any accomplice, no one was apprehended and charged with Ruth's murder. It was alleged in the papers that some of the neighbours knew exactly what had happened, but refused to tell the police. The case became well known throughout Wales, and there was even a ballad published about it, which heaped shame on the unknown perpetrators and reminded them of the judgment that awaited them on the other side of the grave, literally putting the fear of God into them, but it didn't work. Where Ruth was buried, I don't know, but her family at Phosophyne attended Capel Ewan Independent Chapel. At the inquest, her grandmother revealed that Ruth's mother was dead, and she had a sister. Her grandmother, Martha Jones, had seen her about a month before her death as she passed Phosophyne. She'd not said anything about being courted or being pregnant and was hearty and cheerful. Ruth's father seemed to have been absent. In the 1841 census, Ruth lived at Phosphine with her grandparents and 4 other children: Jane Jones, aged 12, Elizabeth Jones, aged 9, Anne Davis, 6, and Evan Jones, an infant. Her name at this time was Ruth Davis. Anne Davis was probably the sister. She seems to have used her grandparents' surnames subsequently. Her grandparents, Martha and Rees, are buried at Blaenycwm. They died in the 1860s and had by then moved out of Phosphine to a nearby small cottage called Tŷ Newydd, of which nothing remains except a scar in a field. So who killed Ruth Jones and why? During the second part of the inquest, 2 strange tales were told of events said to have happened in the time leading up to her death. Her master, David James, said that in March, 6 months before her death, Ruth had been to Newcastle Emlyn and on the way back had met a man on a white horse who had made some threat to her. She was accompanied by others at the time, but the horseman had hidden his face, so he was not recognised. In such a sparsely populated area, it's odd that even with his face hidden, no one recognised this man or his horse, and no one was produced to corroborate this story. It's unlikely, even if this did happen, that this man would have succeeded in luring Ruth out of the farm at night down to the pond. Was this just a story to deflect attention from the real murderer who lived with or near Ruth? Rachel Davis also told an odd tale. She said that a few days before the murder, Ruth had gone to the shop for her and had been gone a long time. On her return, she said she had met a great Newfoundland dog, which stood in her way with its mouth open, then ran away, followed by a pack of smaller dogs in full cry as if after a fox. Rachel said this made a great impression on her, and she thought the girl had seen the fairy dogs, which meant a funeral would pass that way shortly. Was this superstitious nonsense intended to suggest Ruth was going to die whatever anybody did? Or was it to try and divert blame from any human agency? Or did Ruth make the whole story up, or at least part of it, to excuse her lateness? And why was she so late? The pregnancy accusation had the greatest significance in suggesting a motive for her killing. Was she murdered by a man who feared being named by her as the father of her child, who would have to marry her, or who was already married? As it was proved, she was not in fact pregnant at the time of her death, but it was the subject of speculation, rumour and gossip. Was there really a man courting Ruth at night? And if so, why was nothing done about it when he was heard in the house? The custom of carrier na gwely, courting in bed, was not necessarily frowned upon. In rural Wales this practice was, it seems, fairly common. A young man would throw stones at the girl's window in the hope of waking her and getting her to admit him to the house, usually the kitchen, sometimes the bedroom. It was often the case that such men were discovered and forcibly ejected from the house by fathers and masters of female servants. But David James seems to have been quite sanguine about allowing an unknown man to prowl around his house at night. Did he know who this man was? Was he shielding him for some reason? Or did he never exist? David James had the perfect alibi. He was away from the farm, and on his own testimony he was accompanied at all times by his farm servant Samuel Evans. But why did it take him 26 hours to bring a cartload of coal to the farm? Could he have ridden the cart horse back in the night and killed the maid he thought would name him as the father of his child? Why were there 2 neckcloths in the mud? One Ruth's, one his. The Jameses left Blaenycwm not long after the murder. By the time of the 1861 census, 10 years after Ruth died, they'd moved to Penygrieg farm in Llandygwydd and had 6 children, 4 of which, aged between 7 and 1, had been born in Llangella, and only 2 born at Blaenycwm, suggesting they'd only just arrived in Penregraeg and had been in Llangella parish since around 1854. By 1881 they'd moved to Athtabula, another farm in Llandegwydd, and stayed in that area. The three sons at Blaenycwm, the neighbouring farm, do not seem to have been witnesses at the inquest, even though the death occurred on their land. David James said he did not think any of them were courting Ruth. But were they the lads who were in the habit of coming to the house and joking with her? Were they the young men Ruth told Anne Evans she was expecting to come on the night of the murder? They had all left Blaenycwm by 1861 and moved to farms very close by. John farmed at Bulcadom and Isaf, just over the brow of the hill by the Newcastle Emlyn Road. David farmed pass by a small holding near Capel Ewan, and Griffith farmed at Gelanen, just below Blaenycwm. What of William Marks, the Blaenycwm farm servant? He does not seem to have been questioned at all. One point agreed upon by the Jameses and Ruth's grandmother, Martha Jones, was that Ruth was not as sharp as other girls and was weaker in her mind than other women. She seems to have had some kind of mild learning disability. The taunts and accusations about courting and pregnancy seem to have upset her. She was a vulnerable young woman who was not effectively supported by friends or family. The accusations made against her were idle gossip, but it seems that gossip led to her death. Whoever she met by that pond, it was someone she knew and trusted, and that proved to be a fatal mistake. Who do you think killed poor Ruth? I'd be interested to read your ideas in the comments. If you found this story interesting, please remember to hit the like button and check out my other videos. And as ever, thank you for watching.